We are back on Taking Care of Business on Koerner Radio News Talk, 1180, 1230 KGEO, 1410 KERI in Albuquerque, New Mexico on 1000 KKIM, and now on the Internet on knookmedia.com, serving Richmond, Oakland, and the San Francisco Bay Area. So, Clay, what do you think of Larry Julian?
I like Larry. Of course, being a Christian, I'd have to like him.
Well, that's a great book, God is My CEO. I can't get into it.
He's a converted Jew. That's interesting, too.
Yeah. Well, we're going to take a little turn here, get back into some politics. And what do you mean, yuck?
Politics. I hate politics.
Yeah, you do hate politics. I doubt that very much.
I'll be in Sacramento on the 19th.
Are you really?
Meeting with legislators, yeah.
Oh, that's right. It's your conference time.
Not looking forward to it.
Yeah, I was there 3 weeks ago. But we have a gentleman, Dan Schnur.
For
Schnur, who's running for Secretary of State. Dan, welcome to Taking Care of Business.
Hey, guys, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
So you're running for Secretary of State, and you're running as that is a partisan office, right? Or is it a non?
It is a partisan office, but part of my goal is to make it a nonpartisan office. I'd argue that Secretary of State is the state's chief elections officer, and just like you wouldn't want the umpire wearing a Giants or a Dodgers jersey, I don't think you'd want the person in charge of the state's elections suiting up for either party. So I think it's an office that ought to be held by a nonpartisan independent.
Boy, that sounds good, but in the practical world of politics, I doubt if that's going to happen.
Well, I disagree with you, and I will tell you why.
Okay.
Our research shows that most Californians agree with that. Most voters, as you know, are partisan and for all the best of reasons. They have very strong opinions on the issues that affect them and their families. So they want to see strong partisans elected to legislature, to Congress, and so on. But they don't think that the person who's in charge of the state's elections ought to have a vested interest in either of the major parties. And they like the idea of an honest broker overseeing the elections, if only to increase the chances that someone's not trying to help one party's prospects at the expense of the other.
Which unfortunately happens. Okay, now, Clay, he's disagreed with the host, but he's actually made a very good point. So I think I like this guy already.
You do? Good for you.
Yeah.
But no, I agree. Independence.
He disagreed with the host with the utmost of respect and regard.
Yeah, definitely. But no, I think also, in addition to your position being independent, I think that the insurance commissioner ought to be independent as well.
Well, I agree.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure there's other positions too.
School principals don't hold their jobs as Republican or Democrats. Police chiefs and sheriffs don't. Why should somebody in a job like this one be suiting up for one team or the other?
Sure.
Oh, exactly.
Definitely.
Exactly.
So just to kind of refresh our listeners' memories, what does the Secretary of State do other than elections?
Sure. So the Secretary of State has several responsibilities, three of which are probably of most direct relevance to your listeners. One, the office does oversee elections and voting. Second, as a component to that, the office oversees campaign fundraising and campaign finance. And third, particularly for this program, the Secretary of State also oversees the issuance of new business licenses in California. And I would take a wild guess, guys, that you are not completely convinced and satisfied that the state of California is doing everything it possibly can to create jobs and grow the economy here. Is that a fair guess?
Well, I don't know.
Yeah. Let me think about that for a second.
I think that answers the question.
Yeah,
I don't want to get audited.
Yeah, there you go.
So be very careful what I say here.
Yeah. Dan, one of the things, speaking of voter fraud, one of the things that just really irks me is, and, every election we usually have somebody on from, some group that's monitoring the elections. Here in Kern County, we had, what was it? They had a gentleman's name was like R. Smith. And by the time they were done, there was like 14 different people voting at that same address. It was Ray Smith, Raymond Smith, R.J. Smith. I'm not too sure the guy was alive. And yet, here's this kind of voter fraud going on. It's picked up all the time, and yet I've yet to hear anybody from any political party that's ever prosecuted for the voter fraud. It just keeps on rolling on. How do you prevent this?
Well, this is, to me, one of the most ridiculous discussions that takes place in politics, because, in fact, there's already an answer. People on one side of the fence argue that there's way too much voter fraud and you have to do something about it. People on the other side of the fence say, oh, no, it's voter suppression. And you know what? The courts have made it pretty clear that any state legislature that wants to can require a photo ID for voters. But if, and only if they provide logistical assistance and transportation assistance, and should it be necessary, some financial assistance for an eligible voter who doesn't have the wherewithal to get an ID of their own, we'll help them get one. And instead of saying no IDs under any circumstances, several judges have said you can require an ID. Just make sure if somebody doesn't have a car, if somebody doesn't have the financial means, then help them get it and make sure that they're an eligible citizen so they are eligible to vote.
We're having a conversation with Dan Schnur, who's running for Secretary of State. So Dan, you're actually saying that you are for the photo ID, obviously.
As long as you provide that transportation and logistical assistance to eligible voters who wouldn't be able to get one otherwise, we don't want to, and I know you guys agree with me on this, we don't want to deprive any eligible citizen who can vote of the right to vote. So if you require an ID, the courts have said, you got to make sure if they can't afford it or if they can't get to the DMV or whatever it is, you help them do it. To me, it's an absolute no-brainer, and it's one of the main issues that separates me from the main Republican in the race, Pete Peterson, who's made it very clear that he thinks that photo IDs should not be allowed. I disagree, so do the courts.
Wow, it's crazy that somebody would think photo ID should not be allowed. You know, why is there an unwillingness? Well, the answer is probably pure politics, but an unwillingness to have political parties tried or have to go to court for voter fraud. I mean, you never see it.
Well, I think this is what happens. You go to Sacramento or to Washington, and you go inside the bubble, and you start looking at the world through a different window, and a lot of things that are very real, everyday concerns to average citizens are just abstractions to them. We were talking. I'll give you another example. We were talking a moment ago about business licenses. Now, Sacramento Bee did a story last year in which they showed that it takes the California Secretary of State 8 to 10 weeks to turn around an application for a new business. Now, what you guys know and your listeners know is 8 to 10 weeks can be the difference between life and death for a smart young businessman or businesswoman. The state of Texas turns around the same application in 3 to 5 days. And the reason why, you'll love this, the reason why is that the California Secretary of State in the calendar year 2014, in a state that's the home of Silicon Valley and Silicon Beach, the state of California stores its records for small business license applications, not on a cloud, not on a hard drive, not on a floppy disk. They keep the records on index cards. On index cards. And if you spend your whole life in the state capital, you don't see anything wrong with that. If you live out in the real world, you understand the kind of problems that can cause. I think this, on any number of issues, is the biggest challenge that we face in dealing with an out-of-control state government.
Dan, tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. I actually drove from my home then in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Washington, D.C. in 1984 when I was 20 years old because I wanted to work for Ronald Reagan's re-election campaign. After I went back to college and graduated, I went to work for George Bush Sr. and in 1990 drove 3,000 miles in 2.5 days because I wanted to work for Senator Pete Wilson when he prepared to run for governor against Dianne Feinstein. I worked in Republican politics until about a decade ago. And over those years, I would tell you I learned how the system worked, but I also learned how it's broken. Since leaving politics, I worked as an educator. I run the Institute of Politics at the University of Southern California. I've served as chairman of the state's Fair Political Practices Commission, which is California's chief political watchdog. And I think over those years outside of politics and government, I've come to understand not just how the system's broken and not just how to fix it, but why it's so important and urgent to fix it in a way that somebody who lives their life inside the Capitol bubble just can't understand.
Crazy. You also worked, I understand, for Peter Ueberroth.
I did. Peter ran for governor briefly during the recall election back in 2003 when Arnold Schwarzenegger was ultimately elected. I was a big fan of Peter's, both from his work with the Olympics and with Major League Baseball. He had chaired a council on California competitiveness and job creation in the 1990s. And I remember he referred to California as a lethal job-killing machine and proposed a set of reforms designed to make the state more receptive to job creation and economic growth. I became a fan of his then. When he ran for governor, I went to help. And after he dropped out, I decided that after all those years working for candidates, it was time to try to prepare the next generation of political leaders. So I work with young people to try to help them understand the importance of politics and government and public service.
That's a worthwhile way to go. When we come back from the break, let's talk a little bit more about your race and about your opponents. We'll be back in a moment on Taking Care of Business on Koerner Radio News Talk 1180.